if you put 100 foreign policy experts in a room and ask them about Europe's response to the Ukraine crisis, you'll probably get 100 different responses, but I bet about 50 of them would tell you, yeah, the response, the Europe's reaction was really too haphazard. It was really ad hoc. It was really kind of all mumble jumbo. I'm delighted to say that our senior fellow and one of our three speakers tonight, Richard Youngs, disagrees. He has authored his excellent book, which I should have a copy of, but I don't. Richard, can you please wave it?
I've got it.
Thank you very much.
Buy it, very good.
In which he makes the case that, in fact, in which he makes the case that, while the response has left some room for improvement, it wasn't actually all too bad. The European Union has figured out rather quickly that its general approach to foreign affairs, that based on being a normative power that leads by example, was not going to work alone. And he credits the EU with mastering the art of geopolitics on the fly. And we're going to hear more from Richard on his thesis and why he thinks the EU's response has been perhaps better than many critics and many EU insiders, as we may find out soon, themselves believe. After Richard, I'm delighted to say, we have an excellent panel of two, not just friends and well-known personalities, but really from different walks of life. One policy practitioner and one strategist, if I may say so. We'll start with Natalie Tocci, who is, of course, director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome, but perhaps best known in this town anyway, for having co-authored the European Global Strategy and working as special advisor to the HRVP, though speaking today very much in her capacity as a think tanker and director of IAI. And on the practitioner side, happy to introduce a fellow Slovak, and more importantly for the purposes of this discussion, Deputy Director General of DG NEAR, that is the Director General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations, woman very much involved in setting the EU policy on Ukraine and Ukrainian reform. So a strategist and a practitioner to respond to Richard's thesis on Ukraine. And with that, I will turn the floor over straight to Richard to kick us off.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming. So you all know that a lot has been written on this topic, including by many of you in the room. What my book does, that I hope is at least a little bit distinctive, is that it tries to step back from the day-to-day of the crisis and reflect on the impact that the crisis has had on the EU's overarching identity in foreign policy. That's the basic subject matter of the book. So there's a lot of detail in the book about the Ukraine conflict, about the Eastern Partnership, Katerina's issues, but the book also tries to speak to broader debates about the evolving nature of EU geostrategy, kind of Natalie's area of expertise. And that's precisely why we've got both Katerina and Natalie on the panel, because the book basically tries to bridge these two areas of debate about EU foreign policy. As Thomas said, many people have criticized the EU response to the crisis for being very insipid, being very weak, very ad hoc. Other people, more critical analysts, accuse the EU of having been too intrusive, too power-motivated in the Eastern region, insufficiently attentive to Russia's perspectives. My book takes a slightly different perspective from these two traditional lines on the crisis and basically tries to tease out the way that the crisis has pushed the EU very gradually and very tentatively towards a different way of thinking about and doing geopolitics. Different way of thinking and doing geopolitics. You all know that when the crisis started, late 2013, 2014, the common call was for the EU to become more geopolitical. Everyone agrees with this, but it actually doesn't add much precision to our debate because there are so many different strategies that can be classified as geopolitical. So the first thing the book does is to offer a typology of different geopolitical strategies. Many of these debates are very academic, so I won't go into them in detail here. Suffice to say, the book concludes that the kind of geopolitics that the EU has inched towards as a result of the crisis is a kind of hybrid form of geopolitics, what I call in the book a liberal redux form of geopolitics. This denotes a situation in which the EU has intensified its diplomatic engagement in the countries of the Eastern Partnership. It has moved towards a kind of combination of mixing quite assertive forms of geopolitics with much more defensive forms of realpolitik on the other hand. It's got much more instrumental and purposive in the way that it's deployed its traditional policy instruments. And today we have a situation where we have the traditional range of EU institutional engagement in the region superimposed with more traditional or classical forms of diplomacy undertaken by member states. So it's that package of responses that I think defines this hybrid form of geopolitics towards which the EU, I think, is moving. This is a geopolitics that is asymmetrical, in the words of the title, because I think the EU is trying to execute a policy that is more geopolitical without mimicking Russia's understanding of geopolitics or without necessarily sharing Eastern Partner countries' understanding of the strategic environment. I think a very crucial change we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years is the emergence of what I call a triangular relationship between EU foreign policy, Russian policy, and the domestic politics of Eastern Partnership countries. I think today you can see that those 3 dimensions condition each other very much more strongly and deeply than was the case before 2013. And I think that's a very important change to the basic strategic environment of the Eastern Partnership region. To clarify, the purpose of the book is not to celebrate this move towards a hybrid form of geopolitics. It's not necessarily to say that it's good or bad. What I try to do basically is to describe and conceptualize the way I think the EU is beginning to change as a foreign policy actor. In this sense, I think we can identify a few defining features of this incipient hybrid geopolitics. Component number 1, the change in policy towards Russia, a lot being written on this. I think if we zoom out, the basic geopolitical change in the EU's approach towards Russia is a change from understanding power as inclusion to understanding power as partial exclusion. We all know the EU has implemented sanctions in many different cases around the world. It seems to me, however, that this is the case where the EU has used sanctions most systematically and explicitly as a tool of European statecraft. So we have the sanctions, and I think offsetting this, we have efforts to, if anything, upgrade the kind of diplomatic engagement with Russia on the more political elements of the Eastern Partnership, but also broader foreign policy challenges. I think this basically denotes a kind of strategic balancing, what strategists would refer to as a kind of soft balancing, a strategy of soft balancing between the EU and Russia, what I actually refer to in the book as a kind of bounded form of containment, a light form of containment with Russia. The way I describe it, and I think this is important in the book, is that the EU has not allowed its Russia policy to dictate its Eastern Partnership policy, but it's also tried to be careful not to allow its Eastern Partnership policy to dictate its Russia policy. So it's trying to carry out a very delicate balancing act between Eastern Partnership priorities and diplomacy towards Russia. So that's the first component. Second component, support for Eastern Partnership countries. Many critics would argue that the EU's basically done nothing of any significance to upgrade the support it offers to Eastern Partnership countries. My book takes a slightly different perspective and argues that there have been meaningful upgrades to the Eastern Partnership framework as a result of the crisis. Interest done this. The EU has not done this. So the kind of strategy advocated by the so-called defensive realists has not been carried out. However, neither has the EU gone to the other extreme, it seems to me, of doing whatever is necessary to upgrade its policies to gain strategic primacy in the Eastern Partnership region. The EU has offered more money, it's offered accelerated cooperation, but it's not given Eastern Partnership countries really dramatic increases in resources, it's not offered membership, and it's not really done what is necessary to provide countries in the region with really robust security guarantees. So, again, a very delicate balance between upgrading commitments to the Eastern Partnership, but doing this on the basis of not over-committing the EU in terms of political commitments. Third component, the issue of governance, support for governance and democratic reform. Interesting thing here is that this geopolitical turn to EU strategy, it seems to me, has not completely eclipsed support for democracy, civil society and governance reforms. Rather, it's made it more varied. It seems to me that the change that's come about since 2013 is that the EU today deliberates on its support for democratic reform much more as a tool of purposive power, rather than simply assuming that the EU kind of rolling over its own norms and standards on human rights and democracy are intrinsically a good thing. The EU is much more apt today to think about the short-term tangible impact of its support for democratic reform and governance improvements. I think this, in some cases, it's clearly the case that the EU believes its geopolitical advantage is this kind of support that it can offer to the region that other powers do not offer. But at the same time, trying to deliver that support in ways that are much more flexible and varied. It seems to me the significant thing, therefore, significant change, is that in some countries of the Eastern Partnership, the crisis has led the EU to intensify its support for governance and democratic reforms, whereas in other cases it has led the EU to downgrade that support, where that downgrading has seemed to be geopolitically optimal. Fourth and final component of this geopolitical turn, relating more specifically to the involvement in the conflict, in the Donbass conflict. It seems to me here the EU's engagement has been much more indirect rather than direct. It seems to me, although I imagine EU diplomats would not agree with this assessment, that the EU has implicitly accepted what in the book I call a kind of managed defeat in eastern Ukraine. Acceptance that today Russia does have a practical influence and power and relevance on the ground, and that accepting this implicitly is preferable to getting into a situation where we have an outright conflict with Russia. I think conceptually, the significant thing here is that the EU today is about engaging in a kind of indirect form of conflict containment rather than direct measures of conflict transformation. I think that difference is actually very significant. So I'll draw to a close here. I think there's some of the defining features of this slightly more geopolitical approach that the EU is very tentatively developing. In conclusion, I would say that I think the overall change that this is having on the EU as a foreign policy actor is that it's making the EU, what I call in the book, a much more consequentialist or utilitarian foreign policy actor. I think before the crisis started, the EU was often criticized for assuming that its norms, the benefits of its model of inclusion was a kind of public good that can be rolled over and exported to the Eastern Partnership region almost as an intrinsic good. I think today the EU has realized that that is not sufficient for a geopolitically attuned strategy in the region, and this is fundamentally changing what traditionally has been one of the defining features of the EU as a foreign policy actor. So I think that's one really significant conclusion. Another significant conclusion is that today we have a much more balanced set of actorness between the EU institutions on the one hand and member states on the other hand. The crisis, I think, has prompted at least some member states to engage very much more deeply in the Eastern Partnership region. As you all know, this is not without controversy. I think perhaps an issue for debate is that many member states are clearly not happy with the German and French leadership in the Minsk process, but they themselves, on the other hand, have kind of been happy to accept this leadership on the part of a small number of member states in a way to reduce their own exposure to the strategic risks of the crisis. So I think this is going to be a defining feature in the future of EU foreign policy, that how the role of EU institutions dovetails or does not dovetail with the growing protagonism of key member states. Penultimate point, has any of this made a difference? How effective has this slightly more geopolitical turn been? In the book, I describe this as a half-new Eastern policy, and my argument is that this half-new policy has been half-effective. The EU quite clearly has not definitively resolved the instability in the Eastern region. It's not, in my view, got to the driving root causes of the security threats and instability. But it is also quite clearly the case that the crisis could have turned out much worse than it has done. And in fact, in 2013, as you all know, many analysts, probably most analysts, predicted that the extent of the crisis by this stage was going to be a lot worse than it is today. So if the crisis has to some extent been contained, I think to some extent this is because of this changing way that the EU has in foreign and security policy. Then my final point, I think opening the way perhaps to Natalie here, is that the book explores this geopolitical turn in one case, namely the Eastern Partnership, and in particular the Ukrainian crisis. Issue for debate. I think that this hybrid geopolitics is actually set to infuse other areas of foreign and security policy as well, and that it may, in a very ad hoc way, be emerging as a kind of EU foreign policy style. 2 years ago, I wrote a book on the EU's response to the Arab Spring, and even then, 2 years ago, in the very different context of the MENA region, you could also see similar kinds of geopolitical balance emerging in Middle Eastern policy as well. I don't actually argue in the book that this is a resounding success. I'm not sure that this hybrid geopolitics has been developed so far in a way that's fully systematic, coherent, or effective, but I do think it may be a kind of emerging geopolitical style that characterizes a general range of EU foreign policy. I think conceptually, analytically, this will require us to update and revise the way that we've traditionally described or conceptualized the EU as a foreign policy actor.
Thank you, Richard.